This is BBC One in the Northwest. Now the news with George Alagaya, Sophie Rayworth and Gordon Burns.
At 6 o'clock, these are tonight's top stories. A hypocrite and a liar. The Kelly family lawyer attacks Geoff Hoon on Hutton's last day. The UN pulls more staff from Iraq. The Secretary-General says it's too dangerous. And the great escape. 12 days in the Colombian jungle after giving his captors the slip.
Tonight we'll talk live to the father of the British teenager who made that daring escape in the Colombian jungle. Our political editor Andrew Marr is at the Lib Dem conference in Brighton as their leader, Charles Kennedy, tells delegates they're the party of the future. And Jenny Scott is live at a petrol station as the cost of motoring rises again. The price of petrol is going up.
And in the Northwest, police use controversial new powers to protect students as thousands of them pour into Manchester for the new term. And how much would you pay to journey into space aboard the Northwest Star Chaser rocket? We reveal the price.
Good evening, welcome to the 6 o'clock news.
First tonight, the final day of the Hutton hearings. And it turned out to be one of the most dramatic. The barrister representing the family of Dr. David Kelly launched a stinging attack on Geoff Hoon. He accused the Defence Secretary of being a hypocrite and a liar. And he wasn't the only one to come in for criticism. Neither the government nor the BBC came away unscathed on this, the final day of the inquiry. From the High Court, George Eakin reports.
After sitting for 23 days, listening to more than 70 witnesses and reading thousands of documents, it is now almost time for Lord Hutton to set out his view of what led to the death of Dr. David Kelly. For the lawyers representing the individuals and organisations who were most deeply caught up in these events, today has been a final opportunity to try to influence Lord Hutton before he retires to write his report. No one watching this inquiry will have forgotten that above all it is a human tragedy. So it was that the views of Dr. Kelly's widow Janice and her family were heard first. Revenge, retribution and scapegoats were not what they sought, the inquiry heard. But government duplicity in handling Dr. Kelly had to be exposed. And the family's barrister, Jeremy Gompertz QC, said the media had harassed Dr. Kelly before he died and his grieving relatives afterwards. He then relayed the family's view of Andrew Gilligan.
We submit that Mr. Gilligan is unreliable and that no credence should be given to his evidence, save where it is corroborated from an independent source.
Denials by the Defence Secretary that there'd been a strategy to name Dr. Kelly as Gilligan's source were false, said Mr. Gompertz, accusing Geoff Hoon of hypocrisy.
If, as the family submit, there was a strategy to out Dr. Kelly so that he could be used as a witness to undermine Mr. Gilligan in furtherance of the government's dispute with the BBC, this was a cynical abuse of power which deserves the strongest possible condemnation.
Common decency demanded Dr. Kelly was at least warned of the plan to confirm his name to reporters, said Mr. Gompertz, but he wasn't. The MOD had showed him a total lack of care as it exposed him to the public glare. Before his apparent suicide on Harrowdown Hill, Dr. Kelly had given his life to the service of his country, said the lawyer. Feeling betrayed, he'd taken his life.
The government and the nation have lost their greatest expert in biological weapons of mass destruction. Yet he was characterized by his employers to suit their needs of the hour as a middle-ranking official and used as a pawn in their political battle with the BBC.
Lord Hutton heard next from counsel for Tony Blair and his government. Jonathan Sumption QC strongly defended the Iraq dossier compiled by the Joint Intelligence Committee. It had been entirely appropriate, he said, that the Prime Minister himself had been involved.
He had commissioned the dossier. He was the minister primarily responsible for the work of the intelligence services. It was out of the question that the Prime Minister should have no say in a document for which he was to be personally responsible to Parliament.
The allegations Andrew Gilligan had reported were a travesty, said Mr. Sumption, a falsehood against which the government was entitled to defend itself. He accused the BBC of misjudging its own story.
The BBC seemed to have regarded this as a routine piece of political mudslinging, chatter in the air. It seems to have been thought that the BBC could shoot off its fireworks and then steal away. The dogs would bark, the caravan would move on, nobody would pay any more attention.
In its closing submission, the BBC responded. Andrew Caldecott QC said the allegations hadn't been presented to the public as true, but as credible.
The public don't live in an ivory tower and make obvious allowances for the fact that this is only a single source, as the BBC made clear. There is no corroboration, and a degree of scepticism must be brought to bear.
Andrew Gilligan's barrister argued that listeners didn't analyse radio reports word by word. At this, Lord Hutton interrupted with a question, one of several he put. Ms Rogers said Downing Street had wanted to get Gilligan.
The response is like that of a playground bully. They do not like what Andrew Gilligan has said, and they want to get him. But this is not a playground. They are senior officials in the government. Their priority should not have been to get Gilligan. He was the messenger.
Lord Hutton hopes to report back in December. George Eakin, BBC News, at the Hutton Inquiry.
And we can go live now to Nicholas Witchell, who's at the Royal Courts of Justice. Nick, it was absolutely breathtaking to hear a cabinet minister described in these terms.
George, you got a strong sense, I feel, of the anger and the anguish of the Kelly family being expressed through the words of their barrister, Jeremy Gompertz. And of course his words had all the force of a bereaved family, and he was, as you say, absolutely merciless in the accusations that he levelled. Arrogance, negligence of the Ministry of Defence, hypocrisy, the false evidence of Jeff Hoon, the unreliability, as we've heard, of Andrew Gilligan. He drew a contrast, though, between the government, which he said had accepted no blame, and the BBC, which he said had accepted that faults had been made, and of the media generally. The Kelly family felt that there were gross mistakes made in the media generally. The media needed to raise its game.
Nick, the final day, any clues, do you think, about which way Lord Hutton might lean?
Oh, I think that would be a very rash road to go down, George. I mean, there are so many complex issues here. Basically, though, he will now take some weeks to decide, to mull over the essential questions which revolve around the culpability of the government in terms particularly of was there any naming strategy for political purposes of David Kelly. Also, of course, the culpability of the BBC in not checking more carefully the original accusations.
Nick, thank you very much. And Newsnight on BBC Two tonight will have special extended coverage of those closing speeches at the Hutton Inquiry.
In the last half hour, a top-level meeting at the United Nations has decided to pull out even more staff from Iraq. There have been 2 bomb attacks against the UN in recent weeks. Live now to the United Nations and our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins. James, it's going to be a big blow for the Americans, isn't it?
It's a big blow for the Americans and for the British, of course, as part of the occupying force in Iraq, a bad blow for the United Nations. But Kofi Annan, as Secretary-General, has simply judged that it's too dangerous for him to leave staff vulnerable inside Iraq after 2 bomb attacks on his headquarters there. Before the first bomb attack in August, he had some 600 international staff working in Iraq. Already he's down to some 86 after withdrawals. Now he's going to pull out most of the rest. He simply judges that the Americans, and to some extent the British, are unable to guarantee the security of personnel, and so he's going to take most of his international staff out to neighbouring Jordan.
Kofi Annan, the UN chief, called last month's massive bomb attack in Baghdad the most vicious in the UN's history. 22 were killed, including Kofi Annan's special representative in Iraq. Pressure on him to protect remaining UN staff and pull them out has been growing steadily in the weeks which followed. A second attack, though less deadly, was an extra blow, and it was obvious at UN headquarters in New York that staff were simply not being adequately protected. It's a very heavy blow to the Americans and the British leading the coalition forces occupying Iraq.
The Secretary General, on the advice of his security coordinator, has ordered a temporary redeployment of UN international staff in Iraq. Today there remain 42 in Baghdad and 44 in the north of the country.
As news of the UN withdrawal broke, I put it to the Foreign Secretary, this was a terrible setback.
Well, it's an unhappy moment, but the United Nations has sometimes had to make similar decisions in similar circumstances. They've always gone back, and I'm confident that they will do. The Secretary-General Kofi Annan has a clear duty of care to his staff. There have now been not one but 2 attacks on United Nations staff in the last 6 weeks. It shows that the terrorists are not just targeting US, UK coalition military forces, but they want to undermine the ability of the international community to help the Iraqi people rebuild Iraq for themselves.
Here at United Nations headquarters, staff have been pausing today, as they do each day, to remember their dead colleagues and friends. Today's UN withdrawal is a sort of victory for those who carried out the bombing. Some UN staff strongly resisted getting involved in Iraq after a war without UN backing. Although the UN itself insists the decision to pull its staff out for however long was made for security reasons and was not politically motivated.
And a measure of the political difficulty, I think, now for Jack Straw, for Tony Blair, and of course for the American administration, the numbers of UN staff in Iraq should really be going up, not coming down. The rest of the international community are desperate to see the UN more heavily involved in nation building, in handing power back to the Iraqis, and that seems a more remote possibility tonight.
James, thank you very much.
A British teenager has been speaking about his grueling trek through the Colombian jungle after a dramatic escape from a gang of kidnappers. Matthew Scott was one of 8 tourists captured on holiday. The others are still being held. Fergus, it's an extraordinary tale. How did he do it?
George, it seems to be in a combination of incredible courage, luck, and a certain amount of recklessness. Here's Matthew Scott. He's just 19 years old and had been travelling on a gap year before university. And this is where he went trekking through the coastal mountains of Colombia. Like other tourists, he knew it was a dangerous destination. His group was heading for the famous Lost City when the terrifying ordeal began. The kidnappers, heavily armed, woke the tourists from their wooden lodge at 4:30 in the morning. 8 of them were ordered off into the jungle at gunpoint. They spent more than a day on a forced march in the rain. But after 33 hours as a hostage, Matthew saw his chance to escape. As the group walked in single file, he jumped from a mountain path into a ravine. This was a leap of faith. He plummeted through the undergrowth down to a riverbank and then stumbled on, all the while knowing that the kidnappers would probably kill him if they found him. He wandered in the jungle for 12 days and survived on just fruit and water. Then sunburnt, bleeding and dehydrated, he was found by these villagers. They fed him on beans and oranges and then called for help. And here are the very first pictures of Matthew after that ordeal, safe in a hospital bed. Speaking in Spanish, he recalled the moment he took that dramatic leap.
The
mountainsides were very steep. I heard the river on my right hand and followed the sound. I jumped off a cliff very quickly. I was lucky not to have broken my arms and legs.
But what about the 7 hostages left behind? Matthew says they're very demoralised and depressed. They include another Briton, Mark Henderson, and for his family, the waiting goes on.
We're just delighted that Matthew Scott is safe and will be reunited with his family soon. But our thoughts are with Mark and the other hostages and their families and friends, and we hope they will all be home soon.
Of course, the search for Mark Henderson continues, and the Colombian authorities say Matthew Scott's given them useful information which may lead them to the remaining hostages. George.
Thank you, Fergus.
Well, as you can imagine, Matthew's parents are delighted at the news. Robert Hall is at their home in London. Robert.
It's been a frenetic and extraordinary 24 hours here. Constant phone calls, constant demands for updates from the press outside. But I can reveal a very important phone call in the last half hour. James, you've just spoken to Matthew, haven't you? What did he have to say?
He's well. He's very surprisingly well. He's still rather bemused and perplexed, and he's rather sorry if he's been a nuisance. But he's well, and we're very much looking forward to seeing him.
Is he still being debriefed?
He's still being debriefed, we understand now, yes.
What about his medical condition? Did he tell you anything about that?
He's got very swollen, painful feet, he said. My feet are very unattractive, he said. And he's lost a lot of weight and is clearly weak and tired, but clearly, obviously, basically fit.
Because he's in good spirits. He was complaining about hot drinks, I'm told.
He likes his tea, and he didn't think that the tea that was being provided for him in Colombia was up to scratch.
How will he have coped with the whole thing?
I think he will have coped very well. He's very strong, slightly obstinate,
rather determined, and he will, in many ways, have gone his own way.
James, thank you very much indeed. And I know you've also spoken and passed on your wishes to the Hendersons. And just a footnote from me, Matthew's sister Molly has held a tiny photo, kept it with her for 12 days whilst he's been missing. She's carried it with her, taken it to school, kept it with her at all times. Well, if all goes well and the family should hear tomorrow morning, she'll see him in person over the weekend.
Robert, thank you very much. Now, you may remember yesterday we told you about the toddler left at a hospital in the West Midlands. Well, the mother has now been found after she went back to the hospital today. They say they won't be pursuing criminal proceedings.
Charles Kennedy has told his party the Lib Dems are the party of the future. He was speaking to an upbeat conference in Brighton following the party's victory in the Brent East by-election. Well, our political editor Andrew Marr is there. Andrew, over to you.
Well, after that London by-election victory, it was always going to be the case that the Lib Dems had a kind of warm glow hanging over them during their conference, and as I hope you can see, so it has turned out. But the real political question is whether this is some kind of political climate change, whether something fundamental is going on, or whether for the Liberal Democrats it's just another freak Indian summer.
Brighton's always been a place people come to have fun. Whether it's the aristocratic, flashy fun of George IV and his cronies, or the cool, stylish fun of the modern town. Fresh from their Brent by-election victory, the Liberal Democrats have certainly been having fun here this week, even if cool and stylish aren't the first words that come to mind.
By-election in the town, Labour's vote is going down, going down.
But last week's Brent East by-election victory is one thing. With 54 common seats, can the Lib Dems really challenge now at national level? Here is Charles Kennedy's boldest claim so far.
Last year, I said it was a realistic ambition for us to start overtaking the Conservatives in British politics. This year, be in no doubt, we are overtaking the Conservatives. Be in no doubt, we are the only credible challenge to the government.
And for him, challenge has meant opposition to the Iraqi war above all. He dismissed the Tory leadership on this, charlatans and chancers, he called them, and turning to Labour, attacked the Prime Minister for misleading both Commons and people.
This is supposed to be a parliamentary democracy that we're living in our country. And what we've seen instead is a small clique driving us into war, disregarding widespread public doubts. That is not acceptable to the people of Britain.
The hope for the Liberal Democrat is that disillusion with Tony Blair and lack of interest in the Tories gives them their best chance for 20 years.
We're going to go out there and we're going to fight for a renewed and better and more united Britain. That's our cause. That's our chance. Let's go for it together.
And applause. But the real flattery is that in Tory and Labour headquarters they're sharpening their knives. At last, this man's a bit of a threat.
And he's particularly a threat in electoral terms to the Tory party, because some 75% of the seats that the Liberal Democrats would like to take next are Tory seats. And they're targeting the constituencies of prominent Conservatives in the House of Commons first and foremost. I think what we're going to see, is a really savage fight now between the Tories and the Liberal Democrats, with the Tories saying effectively to the country, trouble is, this is a party of left-wing people trying to troll for right-wing votes.
Andrew, in the past, Charles Kennedy's been criticised for being too laid back. Has he changed that perception, do you think?
Well, not particularly. The other party leaders find him incredibly irritating because they don't think he's focused and angry and on the game enough to be a real party leader. He seems to amble through life, and yet it's doing things for him that they can't do for their parties. He is enormously successful, and perhaps the message is they should start to relax a little too.
Andrew, thank you.
The time is 19 minutes past 6.
A reminder of tonight's top story. The last day of the Hutton inquiry has heard the Defence Secretary, Geoff Hoon, called a hypocrite by the barrister for Dr. David Kelly's family.
Later in the programme, why there's a double whammy on the way for motorists at the petrol pump. And England fans are told he won't be allowed in for next month's Euro 2004 qualifier with Turkey in Istanbul.
Later on BBC London News, the last major killer still on the rise, the lung disease that goes untreated, and our love. The lone Londoner rubbing shoulders with the all-American stars at tonight's Black Music Awards, the Mobos.
The US Navy doesn't want them anymore, so in the next few weeks a flotilla of rusting ships known as the Ghost Fleet will be towed to Hartlepool for scrap. Good news for the yard that's got the work. It'll create 200 jobs. But each ship has around 100 tons of dangerous asbestos on board, which will end up in a nearby landfill site. For tonight's 6 special report, David Shukman reports on the controversy surrounding the scrapping of the ghost ships.
They call it the Ghost Fleet, old US Navy ships, rusting and unwanted, some moored here in Virginia for 20 years. We filmed them a few days ago. Each one is insulated with 100 tons of asbestos. Any day now, the first of 13 will set off for Britain. Now imagine this kind of filthy weather right out in the middle of the Atlantic, hitting these old ships as they're towed across on that long journey to Britain. The fear is that some of them might not make it and could add to the pollution that this whole operation is meant to avoid. The ships are heading for Teesside to a recycling centre, and the man in charge says the journey and the dismantling will all be perfectly safe.
If we saw there was a significant risk of an incident at sea with them, we wouldn't bring them. They're empty ships and they're coming here to be recycled, and it'll be done in the proper manner, health and safety, where all the licences are in place that we need. And it's just what we've been doing for the last 30 years already, satisfactory.
The American ships will be towed in here. Picture them all lined up, moored together. Now this whole area will be drained to create an enormous dry dock. It's here that the ships will be sliced up for scrap. Anything hazardous taken off to a landfill site just next door. That's the controversial part of this. The order will create 200 jobs, but it does mean handling the asbestos on each ship. The company is experienced in this, but that hasn't stopped local people worrying about pollution. Barbara Cannell, who lives nearby, lost her husband to a disease caused by asbestos. She doesn't want any more of it brought here.
We've got enough muck over here, you know, so why should we have to have these boats coming over? And my main concern is the men and the people who live round where the boats are going to go. Because you don't have to work with it, you can live near it and you can still contract the asbestos disease.
So dealing with the Ghost Fleet involves a trade-off, the risks of importing an American problem against the benefits to the Teesside economy. David Shukman, BBC News.
The redundant American ships heading to Hartlepool and the safety concerns over how to scrap them.
Now, bad news for motorists today. The hike in petrol tax postponed from the Chancellor's budget will hit the pumps next week. That's a rise of £0.0125 per litre. On top of that, the oil-producing countries have decided to cut production, and that could push up prices even more. Well, Jenny Scott's at a petrol station. This is going to irritate motorists a lot, isn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid the prospect of higher petrol prices reared its ugly head again. This time for 2 reasons, as you said. Firstly, because of that increase in petrol tax which comes into effect next Wednesday. But secondly, because with fantastically bad timing as far as the Chancellor is concerned, OPEC, the oil-producing cartel, has decided to cut its supply of oil to the market, and that's pushed up the price of crude. So you've got this double whammy wending its way from oil fields through to prices at the pump.
Oil extraction, the beginning of a chain that ends with us paying among the highest prices in Europe for our petrol. This bit doesn't cost that much though. It makes up around 8 pence of the cost of a litre of unleaded. But OPEC has just cut back its oil supplies, which has driven crude prices higher.
Iraq's exports are beginning to come back. That leaves less room for the rest of OPEC at a time when oil demand is not growing anywhere nearly as strongly as it was in the mid-1990s.
But if the price of oil changes a lot, the cost of getting it to the refinery doesn't. Transporting oil adds another 1p to the cost of our petrol. That's less than 1.5% of the price you pay at the forecourt. Actually refining the oil, the process that turns it into petrol, doesn't cost that much either. So another 2p goes on the price of a litre of unleaded, bringing the total so far to just 11 pence. But brace yourselves, as soon as the petrol's left the refinery, the Chancellor gets his hands on it. Petrol duty and VAT add about another 60p to a litre of unleaded, taking it to 71 pence. And the Treasury confirmed another increase in petrol duty today, in line with inflation. But why now?
Gordon Brown could, if he wanted to, have not increased fuel duty, but he would have had to find the money from somewhere else, increase a different tax or cut some public spending somewhere else.
The final link in the chain, getting petrol to the pumps, running service stations and, of course, companies' profits. That adds around another 5p to a litre of petrol. So the end result of all that, for those of us who drive, isn't particularly good. Petrol prices are on their way up.
And I'm afraid that rise in petrol prices comes at a really difficult time for the global economy. It's just gathering momentum again. If they go up by too much, the price of oil, then that could knock that fragile recovery. So just because the war in Iraq is over and they're pumping oil again, that doesn't necessarily mean prices here on the forecourt are going to stay the same, I'm afraid.
Jenny, thank you very much.
Football and England fans have been warned they'll be stopped from getting into Turkey if they travel there to watch next month's key Euro 2004 qualifier. But some England supporters are saying they'll go to Istanbul anyway. Here's Adam Parsons.
Teams with a fierce rivalry, a history of crowd trouble and a Turkish police force determined to act tough. All the ingredients behind England's pivotal trip to Istanbul next month. Today the FA met their Turkish counterparts and issued a simple warning.
Well, the Turkish authorities have today said that any fans that are travelling with the intention of going to the match will not be allowed into Turkey. If they find themselves getting through that particular control at the airports, there will be further controls at the stadium, which will also prevent them from getting into the stadium.
But plenty of England fans are still determined to travel to Istanbul. This supporter didn't want to be identified, but told me he already had a ticket and was sure he would get into the match.
I have no fears for my own personal safety. I'm going to watch a football match, I shall go into the ground, I shall keep myself to myself and I shall come out again. It's difficult to estimate how many fans are going out there, but just within the circle that I move, there's a good 150 to 200 people going.
And here's what's in store for them. Tight security at this weekend's game between Istanbul's rival teams. The policeman in charge says his force won't be caught out when England arrive.